Feuerbach starts off from the fact of religious self-estrangement, of the duplication of the world into a religious, imaginary world, and a secular one. His work consists in resolving the religious world into its secular basis. He overlooks the fact that after completing this work, the chief thing still remains to be done. For the fact that the secular basis lifts off from itself and establishes itself in the clouds as an independent realm can only be explained by the inner strife and intrinsic contradictoriness of the secular basis. The latter must itself be understood in its contradiction, and then, by the removal of the contradiction, revolutionized. Thus, for instance, once the earthly family is discovered to be the secret of the Holy Family, the former must itself be annihilated theoretically and practically. Well, here's the second thesis to be an original development that is an expansion of the first thesis, yet probably one of the hardest theses to grasp if you don't heed any of the warnings earlier stated, those being taking the passage slowly and considering that each word here is put here for a reason. In fact, other than two other theses, this is probably the most standout thesis, which probably generates the difficulty to grasp it to begin with, other than coming out of nowhere, to be quite honest. Regardless, there might be a slightly connected thesis that might give context and, well, an expansion to this thesis, but that's about it. But let's actually get going with this, because you better be start paying attention at this point. To approach it carefully, let us first talk about the first major points. Feuerbach's Secular One. See, with how secularism is structured in Feuerbach's works, it necessitates for itself something more than itself, but still a part of itself. That is to say, it must be more, an excess, of itself, because it allowed itself that opportunity to become more than itself, and if it does become more than itself, it can properly function in its field. However, this excess, as Feuerbach's subject formulated the secular one, felt excluded to him when he resolved the religious world, but in fact, it was all along a part of his secular one. But of course, what is this excess in Feuerbach's secular one? Why, of course, the ability to take the divine harmony of the religious world without having its problems. But there's one problem. That problem, ironically, being that it comes into massive contradiction of what a secular basis is. But this problem is what makes the excluded excess included in Feuerbach's secular one. Because the fact that materialism, especially his contemplative materialism, came into conflict with his perceptions of a religious world, but the desire for an other, a holy divine order that makes sense of everything, was lacking in his secular basis. So as to upkeep the desire for an other, there was no other way than to betray his materialism when formulating a way to make intelligible and rational a secular one. Thus, why Marx spotted Feuerbach's errors in making the secular one, that Feuerbach turned to idealism to make the secular one a holy realm, the one in the skies, mind you, to replace his religious world. This was, without Marx naming it, Feuerbach's neurosis and his own fetishization. Ironic that he had to fetishize a secular one akin to being his other in order to make himself feel everything is in order in his secular one. For he, Feuerbach, theorized that despite people creating religions, they fetishized it as to make sense of not only that, but making sense of the world around them. That is to say, they had to make more of the world because it didn't seem right that it's simply that all these bland parts of reality just were there. So religion filled in the holes of what was perceived and understood in one's mind to make sense of the world around them. That is to say, it was their fantasy. To drive home the point of fetishization that'll be tucked in other works of Marx's, let me explain how Marx incorporated fetishization. That was during his talks of commodity fetishism. He described commodity fetishism as that it simply just doesn't contain a simple exchange value and a simple use value in the commodity. There was something more in the commodity that the subject sees in such commodity. For the commodity is advertised in fantastical qualities that it creates a use value that will somehow fulfill the desire that they feel in the commodity, when in fact, it just creates a desire for a desire. To say, a desire to fulfill the desire, which traps us forever in addiction to the commodity as to fulfill our desires, which the use value is now a mere fantasy as to keep the desire for a desire stabilized. Of course, this could only happen in a capitalistic world where capital is the big other to all consumers, and capital rationalizes our spending habits as we try to fulfill our desires. Now let's approach contradictions. Though I made a passing comment in this subsection of this very section right now, describing how Feuerbach's secular one was being fetishized the way it was in his works, don't let that signify that it merely plays a small part. For even Marx points it out how this fetishization for Feuerbach can only make sense in and for itself by the internal contradictions inside the secular one. This is probably where we have to stop merely talking of a concrete, particular contradiction inside the secular one that Feuerbach theorized, and explain what a contradiction is in its universality. A contradiction is the conflict between two things that makes it impossible to tolerate each other's existence and puts each other into conflict. A classical Marxist contradiction would be the one between the working class, in the ruling class owning property, that being private property or the means of production, and the working class working on this private property, on this means of production, but not owning it. Thus, it creates a contradiction. The working class wants to own this because they work on it, but the ruling class wants to keep it all for themselves because they benefit from this ownership, and they wouldn't benefit as much as sharing this ownership, other than the fact that you can walk on it and work on it. Going back on the point of contradictions and trying to explain them, in fact, contradictions are one of the driving force of dialectical motion, equal in respect to the dialectical laws and contingencies themselves. To go even further, and to borrow from Mao, some contradictions can have antagonistic and non-antagonistic qualities to them, and further reinforced by primary and secondary contradictions. Now, I will go into further depth into the implications this has for the realm of dialectics, but to point out an irony just right now, the fact that Mao's dialectics crushed the remaining hidden idealism in Marxism allowed for Marxists a restoration project of Hegelian dialectics and to truly develop dialectics even further. That is to say, because Marxism was finally cleansed of the birth stamps of absolute idealism, it can let dialectics pursue a higher form not thought of before. To bring an example outside of this field, we can talk about Lacan's restoration of Freud, how he restored Freud and restored the previous psychoanalysts, and not make it merely a bastardization of psychoanalysts, but still even developing the theory inside of psychoanalysis. But that's going on at any rate. Now let's actually describe Maoist dialectics when it comes to contradictions. And to rail back on track, let's get to this topic. The antagonistic contradiction is just that. A contradiction between two things that is antagonized and causes actual conflict and change. A non-antagonistic contradiction is also just that, a contradiction that certainly appears between two things, but doesn't necessitate actual conflict, and change cannot be really actualized in this conflict, for whatever reason, until it becomes antagonized. Now moving to primary and secondary contradictions. Primary contradictions are things that subdue other contradictions that may in any other place be primary itself and must be resolved first in order to allow the other contradictions to be dealt with. For if one attacks a secondary contradiction right now, over time, this very contradiction can be reasserted and restabilized because the primary contradiction is already weaponizing this subdued contradiction to its advantage and wouldn't like one of its many arms to be disabled for a very long time. But it certainly isn't a problem to advance onwards to resolve a secondary contradiction, or all of them, if the primary contradictions are at the point where it is about to be abolished themselves. After all of this, now let us return to actually make sense of this section. You see, Once a contradiction is resolved, a thing can be revolutionized. Marx points out the earthly family being the secret of the holy family, and we can trace that back with the points of excess, which that excess is created by material conditions with contradictions in itself of wanting to be more than itself. So, it must create this other in order to make sense of itself. But once we realized that, because of this otherness it forces upon itself, we can see the earthly family fetishizes a holy family to fulfill its desires to be more than just a mere bland family unit. So, as to destroy the holy family, we must abolish the earthly family, which is the source of this holy family. Thus, we can move beyond the holy family as a family unit and establish a new family unit that will not come into contradiction with the new society, hopefully a communist society. Feuerbach, not satisfied with the abstract thinking, wants sensuous contemplation, but he does not conceive sensuousness as practical human sensuous activity. Now finally returning to simpler theses, and ones that expand the first thesis, let's take a big sigh of relief. And let's now try to make sense of this. But as a reminder, let us never forget what just transpired before it. For the past thesis will come to haunt all the other theses now, as it made its stand, and now forces us to expand the connection of each thesis that has been established so far and shall be established in the future, and how their grouping up together reinforces their individuality as well. But for now, let us relax before the upcoming section after this one here. Now this section is also complementary of the past and first thesis. How, you may ask? Because it reinforces the point that idealism, despite being materialism outwards, that being Feuerbach's contemplative materialism that I'm talking about right now, haunts Feuerbach, and he still clings onto it. The fact that he stops with contemplation and dares not to go to the realm of praxis condemns him to stay at contemplation. The fact that he, as said in Thesis 1, thinks it, that being praxis, is some deceptive, horrible thing, and not a part of human sensuous activity, condemns him to contemplative materialism. The fact that he stops then and there and holds up from there is what makes his betrayal of materialism perceivable, if it wasn't already, but also allows Feuerbach to make his statements that he makes, even when a more developed materialism could have done the job better and more sound. But to shift the focus away from Feuerbach and onto the left today, in particular the left comes, I want to make this one point. Only one. The fact that your inability to see praxis and its actualization onto the material world as a part of Marxist theory really destroys your credibility as Marxists, period. Marx may have not painted how a revolution should be, period, but he laid out the fundamental, universal characters of what a revolution ought to keep in mind when it gets particularized for its area. If you think thinking, that being contemplation, only can do anything, then stick to your armchairs and continue moping around. For action is what actualizes thought. Even Zizek said it himself, that being that thought is the universal quality and action being the particular quality, but that's a mere paraphrasing, of course. I don't have the quote on me right now. Also, doing something to aid the revolution isn't opportunistic. The definition, that being this definition, is simplistic and makes mere theory crafting opportunistic. But the laws that dictate left-com behavior makes it impossible for them to see the distinctions between all opportunism and non-opportunism, which forces a collapse on all of them to create their same undifferentiated type. If it weren't for the fact of their pedantic tongue, then they could easily be called cowards in red cloaks. For that is, at the end of the day, what they are, merely cowards. Feuerbach resolves the essence of religion into the essence of man. But the essence of man is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. In reality, it is the ensemble of the social relations. Feuerbach, who does not enter upon a criticism of this real essence, is hence obliged, 1. To abstract from the historical process and to define the religious sentiment regarded by itself, and to presuppose an abstract, isolated human individual, and 2. The essence, therefore, can by him only be regarded as species, as an inner, dumb generality which unites many individuals only in a natural way. To continue a short-lived tradition in this half-hour series that I don't want to be quoted till later down the road, this is the third thesis to be developed that can stand on its own from the first thesis. But I say this thesis is rather an expansion of the fourth thesis. Why? I say for the rather obvious inclusion of the secular one and the religious world, though they be not named explicitly. But this undertone of fetishization that was pointed out in section 4 is here as well. Yet that tirade does not need to be called out again, nor re-explained. But now I shall put it into another scenario, like this one in fact. For now, I want to actually focus on the fetishization aspect a bit more concretely, other than the one that I explained for Karl Marx's commodity fetishism. That is, how social relations that humans created became fetishized, that later turned into a myth. That being the myth of humanity or human nature that capitalist society in particular, is telling itself as it sees itself. In Feuerbach's case, he tried to resolve the essence of religion to human nature, but in doing so, he so again must fetishize this as to make sense of it and see the harmony where none exists. For the big other does not exist, as to paraphrase Lacan, of course. For Feuerbach here tried to proclaim the superstructure of capitalism as a nature found and fixed in all humans, and his human being an abstract, isolated human, mind you, after religion has been developed to the point that he was writing at his time. But he fails, as Marx points out, to see the very clear ensemble of social relations that only was part impacted by religion and all other parts impacted by other things, not religion. As Marx correctly states, Feuerbach, if he were to carry out to a logical conclusion of what he has said, is proclaiming a false universality that appears to be for all times, that being, human nature as he proclaimed it. But even if this were to be for all time, a transhistoric one at that, and a real universality, Feuerbach pettily ignored the social creature that is the human, and created an abstract, isolated human, as aforementioned, that reflects only parts of humanity. Yet Feuerbach cleverly asserts this to be the truth of humanity without having to really explain himself there. And to just go further, because Feuerbach can make this unsubstantiated human individual and couple it with his fake universality, he can then connect all the other isolated humans to where it makes sense only in theory but not in practical examination. Which the salt unto injury is the fact that because Feuerbach doesn't need to prove himself, both it will feel rather impossible to truly make sense of it, he must make it sound like it is a natural and harmonious this connection between humans as to justify his conception of human nature and make it sound rational in the superficial realm.